Beatrice Marston grabbed the dress right out of Evelyn's hands. Not a worn dress. Not a spare. The only decent thing Evelyn owned, the blue wool her mother had sewn before she died, ripped clean from her fingers like it was nothing. Like Evelyn was nothing. "You will not embarrass this family tonight." Beatrice's voice was flat. Final. She folded the dress over her arm and walked out without looking back. Evelyn stood in the center of her room in her undergarments, staring at the closed door. Outside, wagon wheels were already crunching up the drive. Weston Blackwood was coming. The most sought-after rancher's son in the territory was coming to the Marstons' ranch, and Beatrice had just made sure her stepdaughter would not be in the room when he arrived. What happened next would change every life on that ranch. And Beatrice Marston would spend the rest of her years wishing she had never touched that dress. If you've ever felt like someone tried to make you invisible, if you've ever been told that who you are isn't enough to deserve a seat at the table, then stay with this story until the very end. So subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we tell here are the kind that stay with you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The evening started the way most evenings did at the Marston Ranch, with Evelyn doing the work nobody else wanted to do. She had been in the kitchen since before noon. Not the main kitchen attached to the house, where Rosa and the two hired girls moved efficiently between pots and platters. The detached kitchen. The old stone building 40 feet from the back of the house that everyone called the summer kitchen, even though nobody used it in the summer anymore. Harlan Marston had moved the preserving and the heavy smoking out there 3 years ago, and Beatrice had gradually added every task she considered too hot, too messy, or too loud for a proper household. Bread, lard rendering, the twice-weekly soaking of the salted pork. Tonight, Evelyn had been assigned the pies, 32 of them. Apple, dried cherry, and a sorghum custard that Beatrice had requested specifically because she knew it required the most precise temperature and the most constant watching. One pie was already slightly darker on one edge from a moment Evelyn had spent hauling a fresh load of wood through the side door. And she had been watching it with the sick attention of someone who knows a mistake will be noticed and stored for later use. She was 23 years old, and she was spending the most important social evening Copper Hollow had seen in 2 years, making 32 pies in a stone building by herself. Evelyn had known since breakfast that this was how it would go. When Beatrice had come down to the kitchen that morning and handed her the list 32 pies, 2 batches of sourdough, the kidney pudding for the men's table, Evelyn had read it twice, and then folded it quietly and put it in her apron pocket. She hadn't said anything. She'd learned a long time ago that saying something only gave Beatrice more material. "The Blackwood boy is coming," Beatrice had said, pouring her coffee, with the careful precision she applied to everything that mattered to her. Weston Blackwood. "Do you know what that name means for this family?" "Yes, ma'am. Corinne has been fitted for the green dress. She looks extraordinary in it." A pause, just long enough to make its meaning clear. "Some women dress to be seen, Evelyn. And some women are simply better suited to working behind the scenes." Evelyn had nodded and gone back to the dough she was working. She was very good at not reacting. She'd had 17 years of practice. But the afternoon had been longer than she expected, and hotter, and the pies had required more attention than even she had calculated. And somewhere around 6 o'clock, with the sound of carriage wheels and voices drifting in through the small high window, Evelyn realized she was filthy. Flour on her arms up to the elbow, a dark streak across her apron from the cherry preserves that had boiled over an hour ago. Her hair, which she'd pinned up carefully that morning, had come mostly down and was sticking to the back of her neck in the heat. She set the last pie on the rack and went to the door. It was barred from the outside. Evelyn pushed, then pushed harder. The door didn't move. She stood very still for a moment, her hand flat against the rough wood, listening to the voices on the other side of the yard, laughing, calling to each other, the particular bright noise of a social gathering that was already well underway. She knocked 3 times, measured, no answer. She knocked harder. Nothing. Evelyn stepped back and looked at the door, the way she looked at a difficult horse reading it, thinking, deciding what was actually possible. The window was too small, the door was solid. The bar on the outside was a heavy pine beam that Harlan had installed years ago to secure the building against weather, and it sat in iron brackets that wouldn't budge from a push. She was locked in. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, slowly, a cold clarity settled over her. This was not an accident. The bar didn't fall into its brackets on its own. Someone had put it there, and that someone had done it deliberately, and Evelyn was absolutely certain who. She picked up the heaviest thing she could find, the flat of a breadboard, and she started pounding. Weston Blackwood was late, and he was irritated about it. The axle on the second wagon had needed checking after a rough crossing 3 miles back, and by the time they'd satisfied themselves it would hold, the sky had gone orange, and the Marston place was already showing lamplight in every window. He could hear music from the yard, someone with a fiddle, not bad, and the low collective sound of a crowd that had already eaten and was well into the evening's real business. He left the wagon with his driver and walked up to the house alone. That was his habit. His father thought it was rude. Weston thought it was the only way to see a place clearly, without the noise of arrival obscuring everything. He liked the Marston Ranch. He'd been here twice before on business with Harlan, and both times he'd noted the same thing: the operation was tighter than it looked. The fencing was maintained. The water troughs were clean. The horses in the near paddock were well-muscled and calm, which meant they were being handled by someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't doing it in a hurry. Details like that told you more about a ranch than any conversation with the owner. He was cutting around the side of the house toward the front entrance when he heard it. Pounding. Solid and deliberate, not random banging. This was someone making themselves heard. Coming from a stone building set back from the house, smoke still drifting from its chimney. Weston stopped. He stood for a moment in the growing dark, listening. The sound continued, even, heavy, methodical, the sound of someone who had been at it for a while and was not planning to stop. He walked to the building and lifted the bar. The door swung outward, and Evelyn stumbled half a step before she caught herself. She had expected one of the kitchen girls, maybe Rosa, possibly even one of the ranch hands who'd snuck off from the celebration for a smoke. She had not expected a man she didn't know, in a good jacket, watching her with an expression that was neither amusement nor pity, but something she couldn't immediately name. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that belonged on a man who spent most of his time outside, not rough, exactly, but not soft either. He looked at her, the way she looked at something she was trying to understand. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine." She was aware, suddenly and completely, of the flower on her arms, the ruined apron, the hair sticking to her face. She was a very large woman in a work dress that had been too big when Beatrice gave it to her and had not improved with 3 years of washing. And she was standing in front of a stranger at the most important social event Copper Hollow had held in years. She straightened up. "Thank you for opening it. Who put the bar down?" Evelyn hesitated. It must have fallen. The man looked at her with the patience of someone who was not going to pretend that was a plausible answer. "Bars don't fall into brackets." "No," she said after a moment. "They don't. Who locked you in here?" She almost deflected again. It was her first instinct. The deeply worn groove of 17 years: smooth it over, minimize, protect the peace. But something about the way he asked it, without theater, without either horror or false sympathy, made her stop doing that. "My stepmother," she said. "Most likely." He nodded, like that was a piece of information he was filing away. "You're Harlan Marston's daughter, his eldest." "Evelyn." "Weston Blackwood." He said it the way a man says his name when he's introducing himself, not when he's reminding you of his importance. "Were you planning to go inside?" Evelyn looked down at herself. The cherry stain, the flower, the dress that had never been right to begin with. "I was planning to finish moving the pies to the main house," she said. After that, she didn't answer. "Because I was about to go in," Weston said, "and it would be considerably less awkward if I arrived with someone." He held out his arm with the practicality of a man offering to help carry something heavy. "If you don't object." Evelyn looked at his arm, then at the house. She could hear Beatrice's laugh from here, that particular bright laugh Beatrice used when there were people watching. She had 2 choices, and she understood both of them completely. She could say no, and finish moving the pies, and slip in through the back once the crowd thinned, and no one would mention that she'd spent the evening locked in the kitchen. Or she could walk through the front door in a stained apron with flour on her arms beside a man she had met 40 seconds ago, and every person in that house would see exactly what Beatrice had tried to do. Evelyn straightened her spine. "I don't object," she said, and took his arm. The front room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something happens that nobody was prepared for. Not silence. The fiddle player kept going for another few bars before he trailed off. Conversations didn't stop immediately. They faltered, dropped, lowered into whispers. It rippled from the door back through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Weston Blackwood had arrived, and he had arrived with Harlan Marston's big daughter, the one in the ruined apron, who smelled like pie filling and wood smoke, the one who looked like she'd just come in from a full day's labor because she had. Evelyn felt every eye in the room. She was not imagining it. She felt it as a physical sensation, the accumulated attention of 40-some people swinging toward her all at once, and she felt in the same instant a powerful, familiar urge to make herself smaller, to apologize with her body for taking up space, to hunch slightly, to look down, to make the moment easier for everyone by diminishing herself until she barely registered. She did not do that. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she let them look. Beatrice Marston was standing near the fireplace with Corinne beside her, and Evelyn saw her stepmother's face in the moment of recognition. The color left it. Not gradually, it drained, fast, the way color leaves a cloth when it hits water. Beatrice's hand tightened on her glass, and her mouth pressed into a line so thin it nearly disappeared. Corinne stared with unconcealed shock. Then, because she was 20 and had been raised to recover quickly in public, she rearranged her face into something polite and slightly pitying and looked away. Harlan Marston materialized from somewhere near the back of the room, and when he saw his daughter on Weston Blackwood's arm, the expression that crossed his face was complicated surprise, something like relief, and underneath both of those, a guilt that Evelyn noticed and filed away without reacting to. "Weston," Harlan said, crossing toward them with his hand out. "Good to see you. I see you've met my daughter." "I have," Weston said, shaking his hand. "She was locked in your kitchen." The room was not quiet enough to hear that, but Harlan heard it, and Evelyn watched her father's face go carefully still in the way it did when he was deciding how much of something to understand. She was locked in," Weston said pleasantly. "The bar was down from the outside. She was pounding to get out when I came around the back." Harlan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. "I'm sure it was an accident," she said, and watched her father's jaw tighten as he recognized the lie and understood why she was telling it. "Of course," he said. His voice was flat. He offered his daughter a brief, tight nod, not quite an apology, not enough, but real, and then turned back to Weston with the determination of a man steering away from something he wasn't ready to look at directly. "Come have a drink. There are people I want you to meet." The first hour was the longest of Evelyn's life. She got clean as quickly as she could, borrowing a cloth from Rosa and doing what she could with the apron and her hair in the short hallway between the main kitchen and the back of the house. She could not fix the dress. There was nothing to be done about the dress. She twisted her hair back up as well as she could manage without pins, and then she walked back out into the gathering, because the only alternative was hiding, and she had decided she was done hiding for the evening. People talked to her. Some of them were kind, in the careful way people are kind when they're not sure what they're observing. Old Mrs. Tarbell from town took her hand and asked about the cherry preserves, and Evelyn talked about the batch genuinely because she'd been working on the ratio for 2 seasons. Tom Eckert, who ran cattle 3 valleys over, nodded to her and asked about the spring foaling and listened to her answer with more attention than she expected, because Evelyn knew horses and it showed when she talked about them. And then there was Beatrice. Beatrice did not come to her directly. She never did. She moved through the room with the deliberate precision of a woman who has spent decades managing social situations. And she worked her way around Evelyn like water, working around a stone always present, always circling, but never quite making contact. Except once. Evelyn was near the window, talking with Tom Eckert about a gray mare she'd been working with that spring, when she felt Beatrice stop just behind her right shoulder. "Tom," Beatrice said, "smooth and warm. I hope Evelyn hasn't been bending your ear about horses." She does tend to go on. A little laugh. The kind that was supposed to sound fond. She means well, of course. Tom Eckhart looked at Beatrice with the mild confusion of a man who'd been having a perfectly good conversation that was now being interrupted. She's been telling me about the Marston breeding stock, he said. Interesting operation you've got. Yes, Beatrice said. Harlan manages it beautifully. The emphasis was light but precise. Harlan, not Evelyn. After she moved away, Tom Eckhart looked at Evelyn with something thoughtful in his face. He didn't say anything about what had just happened. He just picked up the conversation exactly where it had been, which Evelyn appreciated more than she could have expressed. Weston found her again near the end of the evening. The crowd had thinned. Most of the older guests had gone home, and the people remaining were in smaller, more settled groups. Evelyn had spent the last hour moving pies from the outdoor kitchen to the table, because the work gave her a place to put her hands, and nobody looked at you strangely when you were carrying something. She was stacking empty pie tins when she heard him. You know anything about Roman-nosed horses? She turned. Weston was leaning against the kitchen door frame with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who had a genuine question and wanted a genuine answer. Depends on the horse, she said. I've got a stallion. 4 years old. Gray. Good bone structure, strong hindquarters, fast as anything I've seen. But he's unreliable. 2 good hands have had trouble with him, and I've been told by 3 people that I should geld him or sell him. What does he do? Goes sideways when he decides he doesn't like something. Sometimes there's a reason. Sometimes there isn't. He threw my best rider twice in 1 week. Evelyn thought about it. Does he do it near water? Weston paused. Yes. How did you know that? Roman-nosed horses sometimes have poor depth perception near reflective surfaces. The water looks wrong to them. It doesn't look like ground. She set down the pie tin. It's not a temperament problem. It's a visual problem. You can work around it if you know what you're dealing with. Weston looked at her for a long moment. 3 people told me to get rid of that horse. Not one of them mentioned his eyes. They were looking at the behavior, Evelyn said. Not the cause. Could you work with him? What? The horse. Could you work with him? Evelyn looked at him carefully, trying to read whether this was politeness, the same performance of interest that some men gave to make a conversation easier, and didn't mean anything. But his face was steady and straightforward, and she'd learned young that you could usually tell the difference. Bring him by, and I'll tell you if it's workable, she said. He nodded. I'll bring him on Thursday. He came on Thursday. The stallion's name was Roman, which Weston said he'd named before he understood the irony, and he was a lean, pale gray animal with a hard eye and a tendency to move sideways that Evelyn could see from 20 feet away had nothing to do with attitude and everything to do with something he was afraid of. She worked him for an hour while Weston stood at the paddock fence and watched. She didn't try to discipline the sideways movement. She worked around it, approaching from angles he could process clearly, moving at a pace that gave him time to understand what he was seeing before he had to react. By the end of the hour, she'd led him past the water trough twice without trouble. You didn't push him once, Weston said when she came back to the fence. Pushing doesn't work when the problem isn't the horse's attitude, Evelyn said. He's not difficult. He's confused. Those are different things. Weston was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you doing Saturday? She looked at him sideways. I have 3 other horses I'd like you to look at, he said. And I think better when I'm moving. Would you ride out with me? Evelyn hadn't ridden socially for pleasure, with company in longer than she could easily calculate. She'd ridden working horses on working rides, checking fence and moving cattle. Beatrice had made it clear, over the years, that social outings invited observation, and observation invited comment. And comment about Evelyn's appearance was something Beatrice preferred to avoid by keeping Evelyn out of situations where she could be observed. Saturday, Evelyn said. Yes. He came back Saturday, and they rode for 4 hours. He wasn't a man who talked constantly, which she appreciated, because she wasn't either. They talked about the horses, the 3 he wanted her to see, 2 of which had problems she could identify within the first 20 minutes, and one of which she looked at for a long time before admitting she wasn't sure. She liked the admission better than the answer. It was honest. They talked about cattle breeding, about the difference between Wyoming and Colorado grazing, about a water dispute 2 counties over that was already starting to affect property lines in ways nobody had fully sorted out yet. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when they stopped talking about ranch business entirely. He told her about his father, who was exacting and brilliant, and had never once told Weston that he'd done something well, though he'd told him countless times what he'd done wrong. She told him about her mother, who died when Evelyn was 6, and the specific quality of that loss, not the grief exactly, but the absence of the person who would have been her natural defender in the years that followed. He didn't say he was sorry. He said, "That's a long time to manage without someone in your corner," which was more accurate than sorry, and she appreciated it. They were halfway back to the Marston Ranch when Weston pulled up and looked at her with the particular directness she'd already come to recognize as his way of saying something he'd been thinking for a while. "You know more about horses than anyone I've hired," he said, "including 2 men who get paid specifically to know about horses." Evelyn held her reins steady. "I've had a lot of time alone with them." "Why?" She considered how to answer that. The whole answer was long and ugly and not something you said to a man you'd known for 9 days. "I was more useful to the ranch operation than I was to the social side of things," she said carefully. Weston looked at her for a moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he understood considerably more than she'd said. "Well," he said, and turned his horse back toward the ranch. "That seems like their loss." He came back the following week, and the week after that. Beatrice watched. Evelyn could feel it, the observation running like a low current through every interaction, every meal, every encounter in the hallways of the house. Beatrice said nothing directly. She was far too skilled for that. But there were comments, surface level and perfectly deniable, dropped into the air like stones into shallow water. At dinner, discussing the week's ranch accounts, Weston Blackwood is a very particular man, from what I hear. He has very clear ideas about the sort of woman he'd bring home to his family. A pause, reaching for the butter dish. The Blackwood family is old Wyoming stock, very traditional. Evelyn passed the bread and said nothing. At the dry goods store in town, where Beatrice had maneuvered them into the same aisle, at the same moment, "I do worry about you, Evelyn. You've always been so practical about things. Practical is good. But some men mistake practical for, well, a small sorry smile. For plain." Evelyn looked at a spool of thread and kept her face still. In the kitchen, early morning, when Evelyn came in for coffee and found Beatrice already there, "I suppose he finds you interesting." Like a curiosity. Men like Weston Blackwood sometimes enjoy unusual things for a while. She stirred her coffee. But interesting and suitable are different matters entirely. Evelyn picked up her coffee and went out to the barn. She was not unaffected by it. That was the thing she never let Beatrice see, that the words landed. They had always landed. Beatrice had been dropping them for 17 years with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the soft places were. And no amount of practice made a person entirely immune to that kind of sustained, targeted pressure. The question of whether Weston was truly interested or merely entertained it was already in her head before Beatrice said it. Beatrice just knew how to find it in the dark and press on it. But Evelyn was also, after 17 years, very good at not letting Beatrice see the damage. The Thursday of the 3rd week, Weston arrived at the ranch with a problem. One of his mares had foaled too early, and the foal wasn't nursing properly. He'd sent a man ahead of him with the message, and Evelyn had already asked Rosa to start warming water by the time she heard his horse in the yard. She was in the barn when he came through the door. "She's a week out, maybe 10 days, he said, pulling off his gloves. "The foal's standing, but it's not pulling right. My man thinks it's the angle. She's a deep-chested mare and the foal's small. Is the foal trying?" "Yes. That's the good sign. But it's been 4 hours and it hasn't gotten a real feed yet. Let's go." She handed him the towel she'd been holding without thinking about it and went to saddle her horse. They rode to the Blackwood pasture together, and Evelyn spent the next 2 hours in the wet grass beside a mare who was patient and a foal that wanted to live but hadn't figured out the mechanics yet. She worked the angle, repositioned the foal 3 times, talked the mare through it in a low, even voice that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with tone, and eventually, after a 3rd repositioning and a long, tense 15 minutes, the foal latched. Weston let out a breath beside her that told her he'd been holding it longer than he realized. "You want to tell me how you knew to try the third position," he said. "I've seen it before. Deep-chested mares sometimes need the foal brought around wider." She sat back on her heels and looked at the foal pulling steadily now. "Your man was right about the angle. He just didn't know how far to correct it." Weston looked at her. In the low lamplight of the open pasture, with the mare settled and the foal feeding and the particular release that comes after something that mattered has gone right, he looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded. "Thank you," he said. Simple, no flourish, he meant it. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, small and careful. She didn't name it. She just looked back at the foal and said, "She's going to be fine." It was a Tuesday 2 weeks later when Beatrice made her first real move. Evelyn had gone to collect eggs from the far coop, the one near the back fence that Beatrice had assigned to her specifically because it added 15 minutes to the task, and when she came back through the kitchen door, she could hear Beatrice's voice from the hallway, measured and warm in the way it was when she was performing consideration. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. Beatrice was in the hall, and Weston was there. He'd arrived early. Evelyn hadn't expected him until mid-morning, and Beatrice had intercepted him. "She's such a capable girl," Beatrice was saying. "We're all so fond of her. It's just, and I say this because I think the world of you, Weston, it's just that Evelyn sometimes misreads situations. She's lonely, poor thing. She has been for years. And sometimes lonely people attach meaning to things that weren't intended the way they understood them." Weston said nothing. "I would hate," Beatrice continued, with the precise warmth of a woman who had rehearsed this, "for her to be hurt by a misunderstanding. She doesn't have much experience with men's attention. She may not know what's genuine and what's simply kindness." A long pause. "That's thoughtful of you," Weston said, in a tone Evelyn had not heard from him before. Completely even, revealing nothing. Beatrice said something else. Evelyn didn't catch it, because the blood was loud in her ears, and then Weston's voice again. "I think I'll wait for Evelyn in the yard." Footsteps. Evelyn stepped back from the doorway before he came around the corner, her heart knocking against her ribs, the egg basket still in her hands. She stood in the shadow of the kitchen door and breathed carefully until she was sure she could walk without her hands shaking. Then she went out to meet him. He was at the paddock fence when she came around the corner, looking at the horses the way he always did, not casually, but with real attention. He turned when he heard her. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He looked at her directly, the way he always did. "Your stepmother was just telling me you're lonely." Evelyn felt heat rise in her face. "I'm sorry about that." "Why are you apologizing?" She didn't have a good answer for that. She looked at the fence. "She told me you might misread things," he said. "Attach meanings that weren't there." He was watching her carefully. "Do you think that's something you do?" "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "I used to think I was good at reading situations. 17 years of being wrong about that tends to make you unsure." 17 years, he repeated, "since she married my father." He was quiet for a moment. Then Evelyn, "I'm coming here because I want to come here. I want you to know that plainly." She looked up at him. "I've had exactly one conversation with your stepmother," he said, "and I already understand considerably more about this household than I did an hour ago." Evelyn looked at him, the steadiness of him, the way he delivered hard things without theater or softness, and felt something settle in her chest that was going to take her a while to understand. "The gray mare is limping slightly," she said finally. "Left front. You should let me look at her before we ride." Weston looked at her for another moment. Then he pushed off the fence. "Lead the way," he said. The gray mare's fleft was a stone bruise, not a tendon problem, which meant 3 days of rest and a poultice, and nothing more serious than that. Evelyn found it in 4 minutes. Weston watched her hands move over the leg with the focused attention of a man filing information away, and when she straightened up and told him, he nodded and didn't argue the diagnosis the way some men did when a woman told them something they hadn't figured out themselves. That was the thing about Weston Blackwood that Evelyn kept noticing, the thing she couldn't quite dismiss no matter how hard Beatrice's voice ran in the back of her head. He didn't perform listening. He actually did it. They rode anyway, taking 2 other horses out toward the east pasture, where Weston had been considering a fence extension, and they spent the better part of the morning arguing about whether the ground was too rocky on the north end to justify the post work. Evelyn thought it was. Weston thought it could be managed. Neither of them convinced the other, and they rode back to the Marston ranch, with the disagreement still unresolved, and both of them apparently satisfied with that outcome. He left before noon. Beatrice watched from the kitchen window, and Evelyn felt the weight of that, watching the way you feel weather coming, not the storm itself yet, just the pressure of it building in the air. Rosa, who had been with the Marston household for 11 years, and had the particular quiet loyalty of someone who had seen everything and said very little, put a cup of coffee on the table in front of Evelyn without being asked. "He's a good man," Rosa said. "You don't know him," Evelyn said. "I know he lifted that bar," Rosa said, and went back to her work. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't answer, because Rosa wasn't wrong, and arguing with things that weren't wrong was a waste of everyone's time. The problem was that Beatrice wasn't entirely wrong either. Not about Weston's intentions. Evelyn believed those were genuine, and she was starting to trust that belief in a way she'd learned to be careful about. But about the larger thing, the thing underneath the surface of every careful comment Beatrice had ever made about her body and her appearance and her prospects. Evelyn was 23 years old, and she had spent most of those years being taught, in 100 different ways, that her size was the primary fact about her, that it preceded every other thing she was and determined what she could expect from the world. She'd been told this by Beatrice, yes, but also by looks in town, by conversations she'd overheard, by the particular kind of attention she got in social situations, the kind that slid past her to the next person. The question she hadn't let herself fully articulate was whether any of that had gotten into her. Whether 17 years of being told a thing had made some part of her believe it. Whether, when she sat across from Weston Blackwood and talked about horses and water rights and her dead mother, she was also, somewhere underneath the conversation, waiting for the moment when he would understand what he was actually dealing with and recalibrate accordingly. She didn't say this to anyone. She wasn't sure she could have said it clearly even to herself. But it was there, low and persistent, the way a stone bruise is there, not crippling, not visible, but affecting the gait. She finished her coffee and went back to work. Weston came on Thursday. He came the following Tuesday. He sent a note on Friday of that week, asking if she'd be willing to look at a young horse his foreman was having trouble with, and she sent back a note that said yes. And he arrived Saturday morning with the horse in question and an expression that suggested he'd been looking forward to the problem. The horse was a 4-year-old brown gelding with a habit of planting his feet and refusing at nothing anyone could identify. Evelyn spent 20 minutes watching him before she touched him, and then she walked him slowly around the paddock and found it a pattern of refusals that happened not randomly, but specifically when the angle of approach put direct light in his left eye. "He's got reduced vision on that side," she told Weston. "He's not refusing the obstacle, he's refusing the light. He literally can't see what he's being asked to go toward." "His eyes look normal," Weston said. "They might be structurally normal. Some horses develop sensitivity on one side without any visible cause. You can work around it, or you can sell him to someone who will call him difficult for the rest of his life." She handed the lead back to his foreman. "Your choice." Weston looked at the horse for a moment. "We'll work around it." Then to his foreman, "Listen to what she tells you." The foreman, a weathered man named Garrett, who had clearly not expected to be taking instruction from a woman on his own horses, looked at Evelyn with the guarded expression of someone deciding whether to be offended. Evelyn looked back at him without aggression and without apology, just steadily, and after a moment he nodded. That was Thursday. On Thursday evening, Corinne found Evelyn in the barn. Corinne was 20 years old and had her mother's face and her mother's sense of how a room should be arranged around her. She'd come in wearing a dress that was not appropriate for a barn, which meant she'd come deliberately. She wanted to find Evelyn in a place where the conversation couldn't be observed from the house. "He's coming back next week," Corinne said, without preamble. "I know," Evelyn said. She was rebraiding a lead rope that had started to fray. "Mama," Corinne stopped. Started again. "She's planning something. I don't know exactly what, but she's been writing letters, and she's been to town twice this week, and she won't tell me why." Evelyn kept her hands on the rope. "Why are you telling me?" Corinne was quiet for a moment that was longer than it should have been. Because she's my mother and I love her, but she goes too far sometimes, and I don't always. She stopped again. I just thought you should know. Evelyn looked up at her stepsister. Corinne had the expression of a woman doing something she wasn't sure about, which was not an expression Evelyn had seen on her face very often. Thank you, Evelyn said, and because she meant it, and it was the truth, she said it without bitterness. Corinne left without saying anything else. Evelyn watched her go and felt the complicated, unresolvable knot of feelings she always had about Corinne, the resentment she was entitled to, and the understanding she couldn't quite suppress. Corinne had been raised by Beatrice. She'd been shaped by the same hands that had tried to flatten Evelyn into something manageable and invisible. It wasn't the same, it would never be the same, but it wasn't nothing either. She went back to the rope, and she thought about what Beatrice might be planning, and she thought about Weston, and she thought about all the ways a thing that was going well could be made to go wrong by someone who was patient and committed, and had 17 years of practice at it. She didn't sleep well that Thursday night. She didn't sleep well the Friday after, either. Weston arrived the following Monday, earlier than she'd expected, and when he came into the yard, he had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not troubled, exactly, but something had shifted in the easy steadiness of his face. What happened, she said. Nothing yet. He pulled up his horse. Tom Eckhart told me something yesterday, about a conversation your stepmother's been having in town. Evelyn went still. She's been talking to people, Weston said. He said it plainly, without theater, which was the only way he said anything. Telling them that you've been, how was it put, developing feelings that aren't appropriate for the nature of my visits. That you've confused professional consultation for something else. Evelyn stared at him. She told the Tarbell women, Weston continued, that she's worried about you. That you've been talking about me to the household staff in ways that are her word delusional. The word hit like a flat stone. Evelyn felt it land and felt the immediate, familiar impulse to deflect, to say something careful and measured and protective of everyone involved, to manage the damage without acknowledging it directly. She crushed that impulse deliberately. She said delusional, Evelyn repeated. She said delusional. And what did Tom Eckhart say? Tom Eckhart told her she was talking nonsense and came to warn me. Weston was watching her face. I'm not repeating it because I believe it. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's being said in town about you. Evelyn breathed slowly through her nose. She was aware of her heartbeat, steady and slightly too fast, and the way her hands wanted to clench and didn't. She's been doing this since I was 6 years old, she said finally. It's always a different version of the same thing, which is that I'm too much of something, too big, too odd, too difficult, too delusional. She met his eyes. Whatever makes me easiest to dismiss. Weston was quiet. He wasn't looking at her with pity. She would have felt that, would have recognized it immediately and recoiled from it. He was looking at her with something that was more like anger, controlled and quiet, directed not at her, but at the situation. She's worried, he said. About what? About the same thing she's been worried about since the night of the gathering. He held her gaze. That it's working, that this is real, and she can't stop it by keeping you in a kitchen. Evelyn looked at him. The morning was clear and cool, and the horses were moving in the paddock, and the world was going on the way it always did, indifferent and ordinary, and Weston Blackwood was looking at her, like the thing between them was not in question. I need to think, she said. All right, not about you, she clarified. About her, about what she's doing and how far she'll take it. How far do you think she'll take it? Evelyn thought of Corinne's face in the barn. The letters to town. The 2 unexplained trips in 1 week. Further than this, she said. She was right. 3 days later, while Harlan was meeting with a cattle broker in his study, and Beatrice was supposedly visiting the Tarbell household, Evelyn went to do the afternoon feeding and found the paddock gate standing open. Not broken open, the latch was fine. Just unlatched deliberately, and 3 of the ranch's best horses were gone. The tracks led east. She had them recovered by the following morning with the help of 2 ranch hands, all 3 horses unharmed, one of them having worked his way into a neighbor's grazing land and needed to be talked out of a muddy creek bank. It cost a full day's work and considerable embarrassment with the neighbor, and nobody said openly that the gate had been unlatched on purpose, But nobody believed it had swung open on its own, either. Evelyn didn't mention it to Weston. She mentioned it to Rosa, who mentioned nothing to anyone. But she noticed, in the following days, that the small disruptions were increasing. A tool missing from the tack room, a piece of harness cut nearly through in a place that would only be noticed when it failed under use. A jar of the salve Evelyn made for cracked hooves, a formula she'd spent 2 years perfecting, poured out and the jar left empty on the shelf. None of it was large enough to confront directly. All of it was targeted precisely enough to make clear it wasn't random. Beatrice was not escalating in public anymore. She was escalating quietly, in the spaces where there were no witnesses. Weston noticed something was wrong the next time he came, because Weston was observant in the way that some people are not showy about it, not labeling what he saw, just taking it in and filing it somewhere useful. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I've slept fine," Evelyn said. "You look like someone who's slept fine but spent the sleeping hours doing accounting." He looked at her steadily. "What's happening?" She almost said nothing again. The groove was so worn by now, say nothing. Manage, protect the peace that it required a real deliberate effort not to follow it. "I think Beatrice is trying to make things difficult enough that you stop coming," she said. Weston was quiet for a moment. What kind of difficult? She told him about the gate, about the harness, about the salve. Keeping her voice level, watching his face, monitoring for the reaction that would tell her she'd misjudged how much weight this would carry with him. His expression didn't shift toward doubt. It shifted toward something harder. "She's doing this to the ranch stock," he said. "Nothing that can be proved. Everything that can be attributed to carelessness or coincidence." "That's not carelessness," he said flatly. "No, it's not." He was quiet for a while, looking out at the paddock. Then he said, "Evelyn, you need to tell your father." She looked at the fence line. "He doesn't want to know." "That's not the same as him not needing to." "Weston, I'm not telling you what to do," he said. "I'm telling you that a woman who's willing to unlatch a paddock to make a point is not going to stop at a paddock. And you know that better than I do." She did know that. She'd known it since Thursday night in the barn when Corinne had told her Beatrice was planning something, and she'd understood that planning, for Beatrice, was not casual. Beatrice planned the way a general planned, with patience and purpose and a clear picture of the objective. "There's something else," Evelyn said. She told him about the conversation she'd overheard the morning he'd arrived early Beatrice in the hall, telling him Evelyn was lonely and likely to misread kindness. She'd been carrying it for 3 weeks. Setting it down in the air between them felt like putting down something heavier than she'd realized. Weston listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I know you heard that," he said. "I saw you step back from the doorway." Evelyn stared at him. "You saw me, yes, and you didn't say anything." "I was waiting for you to bring it up. I didn't want to force it." He looked at her directly. "I also wanted to make sure you understood that whatever she said to me that morning didn't change anything about why I was there, or why I kept coming back." Evelyn didn't trust herself to respond immediately, so she didn't. She looked at the horses moving in the paddock and felt something tighten and then release in her chest, like a knot worked loose after a long time. "She's going to do something worse," she said finally. "Yes," he said, "I think so too, and I don't know what it is yet." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "But whatever it is, don't make the decision about it alone." "All right?" She looked at him. "Why? Because you've been making decisions alone for 17 years, and you're very good at it," he said. "And you also shouldn't have to." That settled in her somewhere, the particular warmth of a thing you didn't know you needed to hear until you heard it. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, and he accepted that without requiring more. They rode that afternoon east toward the fence line, where the ground was too rocky on the north end, the disagreement still unresolved. They argued about it again, neither one convincing the other, and by the time they turned back toward the ranch, the light had gone gold and horizontal, and the whole landscape had the specific quality of late afternoon and early summer, that particular light, that makes you aware of time in a way that isn't unpleasant, but isn't quite comfortable either. Evelyn was aware that whatever Beatrice was planning was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather, the pressure of it, the direction. She couldn't see the shape of it yet, and not being able to see the shape of something was worse than knowing it was bad. She found out the shape of it 8 days later. A letter arrived from Weston. This was not unusual. He'd sent notes before, about horses, about plans, once about a waterline dispute near his eastern pasture that he wanted her opinion on. She opened it, expecting more of the same. It wasn't more of the same. The letter said, in Weston's direct and unadorned hand, that he'd been thinking seriously about the difference in their circumstances, that he'd come to appreciate her judgment and her skill enormously, that he had great respect for her, and that, upon reflection, he believed there were differences between them that would be difficult to overcome. And perhaps it would be better for both of them if he directed his visits toward the ranch business they'd begun with, rather than continuing in a direction that might not serve either of their interests. Evelyn read it twice. Then she sat down on the edge of her bed and read it a third time. She was looking for his voice in it, and she couldn't find it. The words were correct in grammar and measured in tone, but they didn't sound like him. They had the particular smooth formality of someone choosing careful language to avoid being direct, and Weston was never not direct. He said hard things plainly. He didn't soften them into polished vagueness. She read it a fourth time and found it, a phrase near the end. Our differences have become impossible to ignore. And underneath that phrase, surfacing like something cold, was the interpretation Beatrice had been building toward for weeks. Every comment about Evelyn's size, every carefully placed doubt, the word delusional, the salve poured out, the gate left open. All of it leading to this one sentence and the one reading of it that would do the most damage. The differences he couldn't ignore, her size. Evelyn set the letter down on the bed and sat very still. The room was quiet. Down the hall, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the house, a door closing, Rose's footsteps in the kitchen, the particular creak of the third stair that had been creaking for 6 years. Everything ordinary, everything continuing. And Evelyn sitting in the middle of it with a letter in her lap that she was not yet certain was genuine, trying to hold on to the part of herself that knew something was wrong with the letter, while another part of her, the part that had been trained for 17 years to expect exactly this outcome, pulled steadily in the other direction. She didn't cry. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and she breathed, and she thought as clearly as she could manage. The letter didn't sound like him, but the letter was in her hands. She put it in the drawer of her side table, under a folded piece of cloth, and she went to do her work, because there was always work to do, and working was the thing that held her together when she wasn't sure what else would. The following days were the quietest she'd spent since the gathering. No letter from Weston. No visit. The silence filled in around her, and Beatrice moved through the house in the particular way she moved, when she was satisfied, not triumphant. She was too smart for triumphant, but settled. As if a problem had been managed and the household could resume its proper order. On the fourth day, Harlan came to find her in the barn. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he said anything, his hat in his hands, turning it the way he did when he was working up to something. I heard Weston Blackwood hasn't been by, he said. He's been busy, Evelyn said. She didn't look up from the stall she was cleaning. Evelyn, she stopped, looked at him. Her father was 54 years old and had the face of a man who'd spent 3 decades outdoors, and the expression, in this moment, of a man who was starting to understand something he'd been looking away from for a long time. Is something going on in this house that I should know about? He said. The question sat between them. Evelyn looked at her father, at the lines in his face, the hat turning in his hands, the way he was bracing himself for the answer, and thought about everything she could say. The gate, the harness, the salve, 17 years of meals withheld, and clothes deliberately chosen wrong, and words dropped into dark places to grow there. The conversation in the hall, the letter she wasn't sure was real. I don't know yet, she said, which was honest. Harlan nodded slowly. I'm going to need to know, he said, when you do. I know, Evelyn said. He put his hat back on and left. Evelyn watched him go and felt, for the first time in a long time, that her father was standing slightly closer to the problem than he usually allowed himself to stand. On the 7th day after the letter, she heard a horse in the yard at mid-morning. She knew his horse's sound before she came out of the barn, the particular rhythm of it, the way it moved. She made herself walk normally, not too fast, out into the yard. Weston was dismounting. When he turned and saw her, his face had the sharp, direct look of a man who'd come specifically to say something and wasn't going to get around to it slowly. "I sent you 4 letters," he said. Evelyn went still. "I received one. I sent 4. He came toward her, not agitated, but with the particular energy of someone containing something tightly. "The first was about the fence extension. The second was about the mare's foal. She's doing well. I wanted you to know. The third was about Garrett and the brown gelding. He's been working the approach from the right, and it's helped. And the fourth was," he stopped. "Evelyn, what letter did you receive?" She went to her room and got it from the drawer. She brought it out to the yard and handed it to him. She watched his face as he read it, and what she saw there confirmed what she'd been holding on to through 7 days of silence. He read it with the expression of a man reading something that is not his. Something that has his name on it, but none of his actual language in it. "I didn't write this," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I knew. I wasn't certain. I didn't write this." He looked up from the paper with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not quite anger, not quite something else. Something that was both at once. The phrase "our differences," he stopped. "Evelyn, I have never once been uncertain about the differences between us. I've been uncertain about the rocky ground on the north fence line, and I've been uncertain about the brown gelding, and I've been uncertain about the water line on the east pasture. I have not been uncertain about this." She looked at him. The yard was bright and ordinary around them, and everything in her that had spent 7 days pressing down on that cold, trained, waiting to be abandoned part of herself was very carefully, very quietly releasing. "Who had access to your letters?" she said. He thought for a moment. "They come through the house first. Garrett sometimes brings the mail up from town." A pause. "But on the days I write to you, I usually leave the letters on my desk in the study before the postwriter comes. Anyone in the house could have taken one." Another pause, longer, or replaced it. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. "Then she had a clerk with her in town 3 weeks ago. I saw them from across the street and I didn't think about it." Weston looked at her. "A clerk, a traveling man. He does letters and documents for people who don't write well. Beatrice writes well." She held his gaze. She didn't need him for her own letters. The understanding moved across Weston's face, not surprise, exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he'd been halfway toward anyway. "We're going to need to talk to your father," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. She breathed carefully. "I know." The letter from Weston, the forged one, was still in his hand. He looked at it one more time, then folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. "Not today," he said. "Your father's in town until Thursday." "But Thursday, Evelyn. This needs to be said while the letter still exists, and while I'm standing here to confirm it." He looked at her steadily. "You're not doing this one alone." She believed him. She was aware that believing him was a thing she'd chosen to do deliberately, knowing that it required a kind of trust she'd spent a long time not being able to afford. It didn't feel dangerous, exactly. It felt like something she'd have to keep choosing, one day at a time, and that maybe that was how trust actually worked, not a door that you opened once, but something you had to choose to keep walking toward. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he looked past her at the paddock. "How's the gray mare's foot?" "Good," Evelyn said. "She can go back to full work." "Good." He looked back at her. "Then let's go look at her." And they went to the paddock, and the morning continued, ordinary and necessary, and full of the work that held things together. While Thursday moved toward them like weather, they could both see coming, and were both, in their separate ways, preparing to meet. Thursday came in cold and overcast, the kind of Wyoming morning that couldn't decide between rain and simply threatening it. Harlan Marston had come back from town the previous evening, and Evelyn had heard him moving around downstairs. Long after the house went quiet, the particular restless sound of a man who was turning something over in his mind without being ready to set it down anywhere. She hadn't slept much either. She was in the barn before dawn, not because there was anything urgent, but because the barn was the place where she thought most clearly, and the morning ahead required clarity. She fed the horses in the particular order she always did, moving through the stalls with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times it becomes a form of thinking rather than work. The gray mare bumped her shoulder in greeting. Roman, who was here for another week of work, watched her with his hard, pale eye and then lowered his head to his grain. Weston arrived at 7:30. She heard his horse before she saw him, the same rhythm she'd come to recognize without deciding to, and she came out of the barn to meet him with hay still on her sleeve, and her hair not quite finished being pinned. He looked at her the way he always did, directly, without ceremony, and she looked back, and neither of them said good morning because they were past the point of social conventions being necessary. "Is he up?" Weston said. "He's been up since before I was," Evelyn said. "He's in the study." Weston nodded. He tied his horse at the rail and came to stand beside her for a moment, not touching, just present, the way he was present, solid and without performance. "You ready?" he said. Evelyn thought about that honestly. She was not ready in the way people meant when they asked that question in easy situations. She was ready in the harder sense, the way you're ready when you've thought a thing through completely, and you know it has to happen, and you've accepted what it will cost. "Yes," she said. They went into the house together. Beatrice was in the kitchen when they came through the back door. She was standing at the counter with her coffee cup, turned partially toward the window, and when she heard them come in, she turned with the expression she used for unexpected arrivals, warm and slightly surprised. The performance of a woman who is always pleased to see people, even when she isn't. The performance lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then she looked at Weston, and she looked at Evelyn, and she read the purpose in the way they were standing, and the performance closed like a shutter. "Weston," she said, smooth and controlled, "we weren't expecting you this early." "I know," Weston said. "Is Harlan in his study?" A pause, barely there. "He is. I'll let him know you're—" "No need," Weston said, and walked past her. Beatrice looked at Evelyn. In the long history of looks between them, Evelyn had catalogued many the dismissive look, the pitying look, the look that said, "You are an inconvenience I am managing," the look that said, "I know exactly how to hurt you, and I am choosing my moment." This look was different. This one was calculating in a way that was no longer hidden, because there was no longer any point in hiding it. "Whatever you think you're doing," Beatrice said quietly, "think carefully." "I have been," Evelyn said. "For 17 years. She held her stepmother's gaze for one steady moment, then turned and followed Weston. Harlan Marston's study was a room that smelled like leather and old paper, and the particular must of space where important things were decided and then left to settle. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he looked up with the guarded expression of a man who has been half expecting a conversation he doesn't want and has now run out of time to avoid it. "Weston," he said, rising. They shook hands. Then Harlan looked at his daughter, and something moved behind his eyes. "Evelyn, sit down, both of you." They sat. Weston reached into his jacket and put the letter on the desk. The forged one, folded and slightly worn now from being handled. "I need to show you something," Weston said. Harlan picked it up. He read it slowly, the way he read everything with the care of a man who understood that papers had consequences. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Weston. "You didn't write this," he said. "Not a question, no. I sent 4 letters to Evelyn over the past several weeks. She received this one. The others never arrived." Weston kept his voice level. "3 weeks ago, Evelyn saw your wife in town with a traveling clerk. A document man." Harlan looked at the letter again. "The phrasing isn't mine," Weston said. "Anyone who's had a single conversation with me would know it." But Evelyn hadn't been given a reason to doubt the letter was real. She had been given, over a period of weeks, a great number of reasons to believe it. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Harlan looked at his daughter. "Evelyn," he said, "what else?" She told him. She told him about the gate left open. The harness cut through. The salve poured out. She told him about the conversation in the hall, Beatrice telling Weston she was delusional and lonely. She told him about Beatrice's campaign in town, the word she'd used, the careful architecture of public doubt. She told him about 17 years of the quieter things, the dress taken the night of the gathering, the meals withheld on pretexts, the work assignments designed to keep her away from visitors, the clothes chosen deliberately wrong, the years of words dropped into the dark places. She told it without theater, without tears, which surprised her slightly, because she'd been afraid of tears, and not because they were shameful, but because she'd wanted to be clear. and emotion sometimes obscured clarity. But she was calm. The way you're calm when you've been carrying something for a very long time, and you finally put it down, and the relief and the exhaustion are the same feeling. Harlan listened. He didn't interrupt. He sat very still behind his desk, and he listened to all of it, and his face did several things that Evelyn watched carefully: a tightening around the jaw at the gate, a slight whitening at the knuckles when she mentioned the forged letter, and at the end, when she talked about the dress taken on the night of the gathering, a look crossed her father's face that was complicated and private, and landed somewhere between grief and a specific kind of fury directed inward. When she finished, the study was quiet for a long moment. "Harlan," Weston said, "I want to be clear that I'm not here to tell you what to do in your household. That's not my place, and I know it. But I need you to understand that what happened with these letters was not an accident, and it was not ambiguous. Someone paid to have that letter written. Someone intercepted my correspondence with your daughter and replaced it with something designed to end a relationship they'd already tried to end by other means." He paused. "That's a considered, deliberate act, not a moment of poor judgment." Harlan said nothing for a moment. "Then, where is Beatrice now?" "Kitchen," Evelyn said. Harlan stood up from behind his desk. He picked up the forged letter, looked at it one more time, then set it back down with the care of a man setting down something he intends to come back to. "Wait here," he said, and left the room. Evelyn and Weston sat in the study and listened to the house. Voices from the kitchen: Harlan's, low and controlled, and then Beatrice's, at first measured and then rising slightly. A door, footsteps, then another door, and silence. Weston looked at Evelyn. "All right," he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's a reasonable answer." They waited for 20 minutes. At some point, Evelyn became aware that she'd been gripping the arm of the chair and made herself release it. The study looked the same, as it always had: the same books, the same map of the territory pinned to the wall, the same photograph of her father's cattle operation from 15 years ago that had always hung behind the desk. She'd sat in this room 100 times in her life, and it had never felt quite like this. The door opened. Harlan came back in alone. He sat behind his desk, and he looked at his daughter with an expression she'd never seen on him before: direct and slightly raw, like something had been removed. "She denies it," he said. "Of course she does," Evelyn said. "I know." He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "I'm going to need to send for the clerk. Find out what was commissioned and when." He looked at the forged letter. "This will take some time to sort out properly." "It will," Weston said. In the meantime, Harlan stopped. He looked at his daughter, and in the look was the whole weight of the thing he hadn't done for 17 years, and was only now beginning to understand the cost of. "In the meantime, I want you to know, Evelyn. I need you to know." He stopped again. Harlan Marston was not a man who said difficult things easily. He was a man who showed what he meant through action and movement, and the long practical language of ranch work, and putting things into words cost him more than it cost most people. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "I should have asked sooner." It was not enough. Both of them knew it wasn't enough. It was the beginning of enough, maybe, which was different from the thing itself, but was also not nothing. "I know," Evelyn said. The door opened again, without a knock, and Beatrice came in. She'd had 20 minutes to compose herself, and she'd used them well. She came in with the particular combination of dignity and controlled offense that she wore when she felt she was being unfairly treated: chin level, shoulders back, the expression of a woman who has been wronged and intends to say so. "I think," she said, "that I deserve to be present for whatever is being decided about my family." "Sit down, Beatrice," Harlan said. Something flickered in her face at his tone, a small, quick thing, gone almost before it registered. She sat. The letter, Harlan said, pushing it toward her across the desk. She looked at it. Her expression didn't change. "I don't know what that is." "It's a letter written in Weston's name and sent to Evelyn in place of the letters he actually sent." Harlan's voice was even. "The clerk who does documents for people on the Borden Road. You were seen with him 3 weeks ago." "I've been seen with many people," Beatrice said. "I manage a household. I conduct correspondence." "For whom did you commission documents?" Harlan said. "I didn't commission anything improper. If this man wrote something false in someone's name, that's his business, not mine." She looked at Weston with the expression of a woman addressing someone who has intruded. I'm sorry you've been troubled by something one of the town people manufactured. But I find it difficult to believe that a man of your standing would come into someone's home and level accusations based on. I wrote it down, Weston said. Beatrice stopped. The morning you came to me in the hall, he said. What you said about Evelyn being lonely and confused and likely to misread situations. I wrote it down that evening because I wanted to remember the precise words. He reached into his jacket and produced a second folded paper, smaller, clearly his own handwriting, written in the straightforward hand of a man who kept records. You told me she was delusional, that specific word. And then you told me she might be developing feelings that weren't appropriate to the nature of my visits. He set it on the desk beside the forged letter. 2 weeks later, a letter arrives, suggesting our differences are impossible to overlook. Phrased almost identically to what you told me about Evelyn. The same idea in the same language. Beatrice looked at the two papers. That's a coincidence, she said, but it came out differently this time. Slightly flatter. The performance had developed a crack. It's not, Weston said. The room was quiet. Beatrice sat with her hands in her lap and her face very still, and Evelyn watched her stepmother the way she'd watched difficult horses reading the small signals, the weight shifts, the place where calculation was happening behind the composed surface. Then Beatrice turned to Evelyn. The shift was so complete and so quick that it took Evelyn a moment to register. One moment Beatrice was composed and controlled, managing a situation. The next she was looking directly at her stepdaughter, and what came across her face was not guilt and not remorse, but something that had been held down for a very long time and was now surfacing with the force of things that have been pressurized. You have always needed more than your share, Beatrice said. From the day I came into this house, the way he looked at you, the way he talked about you, his daughter, his Evelyn, his clever girl. And she stopped, breathed through her nose. You were 6 years old and you already took up more room than was fair. The room was completely still. Beatrice, Harlan said. I gave you everything I could have given a child, Beatrice continued, still looking at Evelyn. I ran your father's household. I raised my daughter here. I managed everything that a slight tilt of her head toward Harlan didn't want to manage, and I did it without complaint. And you stood there every day, just by existing, and reminded him that there was someone he loved before me that I couldn't touch. So you touched Evelyn instead, Weston said. Quiet. Flat, no heat in it at all. Beatrice looked at him. Her face closed. You dressed her to look worse than she was, he continued. You kept her away from visitors. You locked her in a building, so she wouldn't be in the room when I arrived. You went to town and told people she was delusional. You paid someone to write a letter designed to make her believe that the one thing going right in her life was happening because she'd misunderstood someone's pity. He paused. You did all of that to a woman who had done nothing except exist in a house where she was supposed to be welcome. Beatrice said nothing. A man like you, she said finally, and her voice had changed lower, more stripped down, the performance fully gone now, could not genuinely want a woman who looks like her. I know how men like you work. I was married to one. They choose suitable women, and they keep the interesting ones at a distance. She looked at Evelyn one more time, and what was in the look was complicated and ugly and beneath it, so far beneath it that it was almost invisible, something that might have been grief. A woman her size, in a territory like this, she was never going to be chosen. I was preparing her for what was true. You were preparing her, Evelyn said, and her own voice surprised her, not loud, not shaking, completely level to believe what was convenient for you. Beatrice turned to her. You needed me to believe I wasn't worth choosing, Evelyn said. Because if I believed that, I stayed small. I stayed manageable. I stayed in the kitchen with the pies, and I stayed out of rooms where people might look at me and look at you and ask questions you didn't want asked. She held her stepmother's gaze. It was never about preparing me for anything. It was about making sure I didn't take up the space you'd decided wasn't mine. The room held that for a long moment. Beatrice looked at Evelyn with something that was finally, underneath everything else, just tired. You think you've won something, she said. I haven't won anything, Evelyn said. I just stopped losing on purpose. Harlan stood up. Beatrice, he said, and his voice had a quality she'd apparently not heard from him before, because she looked at him quickly and then looked away. I need you to go upstairs. I'll come up when I've finished here. Harlan, please go upstairs. She went. The three of them sat in the study for a while after she left Harlan behind his desk, Evelyn in the chair, Weston beside her, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was better. The letter needs to be verified, Harlan said finally. I'll send for the clerk. If he confirms it was commissioned, then he stopped. Pressed his mouth into a line. Then there are decisions to be made. I know, Evelyn said. I'm sorry, Harlan said. He said it directly, looking at his daughter, and it was clearly not an easy thing for him to say, and he said it anyway. I'm sorry it took this long. Evelyn looked at her father, the lines in his face, the way he held his hat in his hands, even though he was sitting in his own study. The weight of what he was beginning to understand he'd allowed by not asking questions sooner. She had complicated feelings about her father that were going to take a long time to fully work out. He was not a villain. He was also not a man who had protected her, and those two things were both true and didn't resolve each other. I know, she said, which was not forgiveness and was not accusation. It was just what was real. She left the study and went back to the barn. Not because she had work to do, though she always had work to do, but because she needed a few minutes in the one place where things had always been straightforward. Where a horse's problem was a problem you could find and address, and where the resolution was real and not dependent on anyone's willingness to change their mind about you. Roman was at the back of his stall, watching the door. She went in and stood beside him, not doing anything, just being there, and he didn't move away, which after 3 weeks of work was actually something. You're getting better, she told him. He turned his head and looked at her with his difficult pale eye. She stood there for a while. Weston found her there 20 minutes later. He came into the barn without making noise. He never made unnecessary noise. One of the things she'd noted about him early, he stopped outside the stall and looked at her and the horse and didn't rush whatever she was doing. She said something in there, Evelyn said, without turning. About a woman my size never being chosen. I heard it. She's been saying versions of that for as long as I can remember. She was quiet for a moment. The thing about something said enough times is that it doesn't have to be true to take up space. It just has to be said enough times in the right places. I know, Weston said. Do you? She turned to look at him. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He considered it honestly, the way he did. No, he said. Not the way you know it. But I understand what it costs to believe a thing that isn't true about yourself, and I understand what it costs to stop believing it. He looked at her steadily. I also know that what she said in there and what I know to be true are not the same thing. And I know which one I'm standing here based on. Evelyn looked at him. Roman shifted behind her, his shoulder warm against her back. Harlan's going to send for the clerk, she said. Yes. If the clerk confirms it, the marriage is probably finished. Probably. That's going to be complicated for a long time. Yes, he said, it is. He didn't minimize it, which she appreciated. None of that changes what I said this morning, or what I've said before. She looked at the barn floor for a moment. She called me delusional, she said. In town, to people we both know. I know, that word gets into things. It does, he said. And what she said about you in town will get sorted out the same way lies get sorted out slowly, by people seeing the truth of you over time. It's not satisfying, but it's how it works. She looked up at him. You sound very certain about that. I'm certain about you, he said, with the simplicity of a man who means exactly what he says and not one word more. The rest of it I'm working on. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. You're still wrong about the north fence line. I know you think that. The ground is too rocky. The ground is manageable. You're going to lose 3 posts in the first winter. Then we'll reset them. She looked at him, and the almost smile became real, brief and crooked, and catching her off guard the way real things sometimes do. He looked back at her with the expression she'd been cataloging for weeks now, the one that wasn't about what she looked like or what she was supposed to be, but was just about her, specifically, exactly as she was. Come out here tomorrow, she said. I'll come out tomorrow. Early. I want to finish working Roman on the water trough. Early, he agreed. She turned back to the horse, and Weston stayed in the doorway, and the barn was quiet around them, with the particular quality of quiet that comes after a loud thing has finished. Not peaceful, exactly, not resolved. The clerk still needed to be found. Harlan still needed to finish a conversation that had been 17 years in the making. Beatrice was upstairs in a house that was about to stop being hers. But Evelyn was standing in the barn, and the horse wasn't moving away from her, and Weston was in the doorway. And for right now, in this 1 hour, that was enough to stand on. She'd built things from less. She knew how to work with difficult ground. The question of the north fence line was still unresolved. It was still unresolved the following morning, and the morning after that, and the week that followed, because what came in the days after the study conversation had its own momentum and its own demands, and the fence line was the kind of disagreement that required time and stubbornness, and neither of them was in short supply of either. Harlan sent for the clerk the same afternoon. He came on Friday, a thin man named Hooper, with ink-stained fingers, and the wary expression of someone who knew that the reason he'd been summoned was not good for him. He sat in Harlan's study with his hat turning in his hands, much as Harlan's had been turning earlier in the week, and when Harlan laid the forged letter on the desk and asked him if he recognized the work, Hooper's face did a complicated and completely legible thing. He tried the denial first. It lasted approximately 3 minutes. Harlan was not a man who escalated. He didn't raise his voice or pound the desk, but he had the particular stillness of someone who was going to continue sitting in this room for as long as necessary, and Hooper apparently found that more difficult to argue with than anger would have been. He'd been paid $4 to write the letter. The commission had come from a woman, as Obese says, needing a delicate communication handled, something involving a young woman who'd become confused about a situation and needed to have it cleared up. He'd been told the letter would be shown to the young woman, not sent in someone else's name. He'd been told it wasn't a forgery. "Did you believe that?" Harlan said. Hooper looked at the desk. "No," he said. He said it quietly, which was more honest than an excuse would have been. Harlan sent him away without the law, which surprised Evelyn when she heard about it later. He was used, Harlan told her, not the same as being the one who chose to use him. Evelyn thought about that. That's a generous reading. "Maybe," Harlan said. "Or maybe I've been thinking about what it costs to hold people fully accountable for things they were led into by someone more deliberate than they were." He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "Either way, Hooper's not the problem I'm concerned with." The problem he was concerned with was upstairs. Beatrice had not come down to dinner on Thursday. She had not come down on Friday either. Rosa brought trays up and brought them back mostly untouched, and the house had the particular quality of a place where something large was happening very quietly behind closed doors. Corinne arrived on Saturday. She'd been staying with the Tarbell family. Beatrice had arranged it, supposedly, for a social visit, though Evelyn now understood it had the purpose of keeping Corinne out of the house during the letter period. When she came through the door and found Evelyn in the kitchen, she stopped and looked at her stepsister with the expression of someone who had been piecing a story together from fragments and was now looking at the completed picture for the first time. "Mama told me," Corinne said. "Her version." "I imagine her version is different from mine," Evelyn said. "Yes." Corinne sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was unusual. She generally held herself with a careful formality around Evelyn that kept a specific distance between them. "She told me you went to Father with a letter you claimed Weston Blackwood didn't write. She said it was a misunderstanding about how correspondence works and that you'd twisted it to cause trouble." "And what do you think?" Evelyn said. Corinne was quiet for a moment. "I think she's done things I've made myself not see," she said. "For a long time." She looked at the table. "When I was 12, she told me that if you were ever allowed to shine, you'd take everything in the room, so we had to be strategic. I thought that was just how things worked, how families worked." A pause. "I didn't question it because questioning it meant looking at myself, too." Evelyn looked at her stepsister Corinne's careful face, the effort it was taking her to say this, the particular discomfort of someone examining a thing they'd previously chosen not to examine. "You came and warned me," Evelyn said, "in the barn. That first time." "Yes." "That mattered." Corinne looked up. "I didn't do enough." "No," Evelyn said, "you didn't. You did something, which is more than nothing." She pulled out the chair across from Corinne and sat down. "What happens now is not about settling what happened before. I can't do that, and I won't. But I'm also not going to pretend we're fine if we're not going to try to actually be fine." That's fair, Corinne said. She sounded like she meant it. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't forgiveness, complete and clean, the kind that exists in stories that aren't honest about what damage costs. It was two women sitting across a kitchen table, acknowledging that the thing between them was real and complicated, and would take time they might or might not have. And that was a more truthful beginning than a performance of reconciliation would have been. The harder conversation happened on Monday. Harlan came to find Evelyn in the late afternoon. She was checking fence on the south pasture, and he came out on horseback, which meant he'd made a decision and was bringing it to her rather than calling her in, which was a small thing, but she noticed it. I've told Beatrice she needs to make arrangements, he said. Evelyn looked at him. You're sure? I'm sure. He pulled up beside her at the fence line. I've been thinking since Thursday about what she said in the study. About you taking up more room than was fair. He was quiet for a moment. You were 6 years old, Evelyn. You were 6 years old when she decided you were a problem to manage. And I stopped, started again. I let it happen. Not because I didn't love you, because I wasn't paying attention in the right places. Because it was easier to believe everything was fine. Evelyn looked at the fence line. The south pasture was green, the grass long enough to move in the light wind that had come up in the afternoon. You're paying attention now, she said. Too late. Later than it should have been, she said. Not too late. She paused. Those aren't the same thing either. Harlan looked at his daughter for a long moment, with the expression of a man who is not sure he deserves the distinction she's making, but is willing to try to earn it. There's something else I need to say, he said. All right. Weston Blackwood is a good man. I know, Evelyn said. He came into my study and laid out what had happened with the kind of clarity and fairness I don't see often, Harlan said. He could have been angry. He had reason to be. He wasn't. A pause. He was also sitting next to you the whole time, and I saw how he looked at you, and I want you to know that your mother, he stopped, and the mention of her mother was unexpected, and it landed somewhere private. Your mother would have been very glad to see that. Evelyn looked away, out across the pasture. The wind moved through the grass. Don't make it harder than it needs to be, she said, which was the closest she could get right now. I know, he said. I know. They rode back toward the house together as the afternoon light went flat, and the clouds that had been threatening rain since morning finally made good on the threat. Coming down soft and steady over Copper Hollow and the Marston Ranch and the south pasture fence that needed 2 new posts on the eastern corner and the summer kitchen with its good stone walls, and all the ordinary, ongoing life of a place that was, however imperfectly, still standing. Beatrice Marston came downstairs that evening for the first time since Thursday. She came to the dinner table, and she sat at her place, and she ate in silence, and she did not look at Evelyn, and she did not look at Harlan in the way she normally looked at him, and the table was quieter than Evelyn could ever remember it being. After dinner, Evelyn was clearing dishes when she heard her stepmother in the hallway. She paused. She could see Beatrice in profile still dressed well, still perfectly composed in the surface sense, but with something underneath that had changed in a way that wouldn't change back. Beatrice stopped in the hallway and looked toward the kitchen, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the distance of the house. You'll still be you, Beatrice said finally, when all of this settles. You'll still have the body you have, and the life you have, and the territory will still look at you the way it looks at you. Yes, Evelyn said. I know, you think that, man. I'm not arguing with you about Weston tonight, Evelyn said. Or any other night. Beatrice looked at her. Something in her face moved very slightly, and then it was still again. Then let him decide what he wants, Beatrice said, which was almost word for word what Evelyn had thought in her room the night after the study, though it came from Beatrice with entirely different intent. I intend to, Evelyn said, and let me decide what I am worth. She picked up the dishes and went back to the kitchen, and behind her the hallway was quiet, and outside the rain continued steady and soft over the Marston Ranch. And somewhere in the territory to the east, Weston Blackwood was coming back in the morning. Weston came in the morning the way he said he would. The rain had stopped overnight and left everything clean and slightly raw-looking, the way Wyoming looked after a good soaking the grass more intensely green, the fence posts darker, the air with that particular quality of having been rinsed. Evelyn was already at the water trough with Roman, when she heard his horse in the yard, and she didn't stop what she was doing because stopping would have made the moment into something it didn't need to be. He tied up and came to the paddock fence and watched her work the horse. Roman was doing better, genuinely better. Not the kind of better that's wishful thinking, but the measurable kind, where the behavior you'd been targeting had actually shifted. She'd been bringing him past the trough from the right angle for 10 days now, giving him time to process what he was seeing before asking him to move, and the last 3 sessions he'd passed it without the sideways panic that had been the problem from the start. This morning he walked past it twice, clean, no drift, no planting, no whites of the eyes. "There it is," Weston said from the fence. "Don't celebrate yet," Evelyn said. "Try it in different light tomorrow, and with another horse nearby. The conditions matter. You're difficult to impress," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." She brought Roman back to his stall and came out to the fence, and they stood there for a moment in the early morning with the cleaned air around them, and the particular ease that had developed between them over the past weeks, not comfortable in the sense of being unchallenging, but settled, like ground that has been tested and found to hold. "How was last night?" he said. "Quiet," she said. "Beatrice came to dinner. Didn't talk. Harlan didn't push it." She looked at the paddock. "She's planning her next move. That's what the quiet means." "You think there is a next move?" "There's always a next move with her," Evelyn said. "The question is what form it takes when she's cornered." She paused. "I've been thinking about it. She's not going to admit the letter. Hooper already confirmed it, but she'll say Hooper is unreliable, and she's not wrong that a traveling clerk isn't exactly the most authoritative witness." "Harlan believes it. Harlan believes it," Evelyn agreed. "But believing it and acting on it are different, and acting on it costs him things he's been avoiding paying for a long time." She looked at Weston. "I'm not sure how far he'll actually go. I want to be, but I'm not sure." Weston was quiet for a moment. "I think he'll go further than you expect," he said. I watched his face in the study. That wasn't a man deciding what was convenient. That was a man deciding what he could live with. "You've known him less than a month." "Yes," Weston said. "But I've known a lot of men making decisions." He held her gaze. "Sometimes it's easier to see from the outside." She didn't argue with that. She had been inside this particular situation for 23 years, and inside was not always the best place to see. They rode out to the east fence line that morning, the unresolved disagreement about the north end waiting for them, with the patience of problems that aren't going anywhere. Weston examined the rocky ground for the 3rd time, and Evelyn examined it beside him, and they reached the same conclusions they'd reached before his, that it was manageable. Hers that manageable was not the same as sensible. "You're going to reset those posts twice in the first 2 years, she said. "Maybe once. Twice. The freeze-thaw on rocky ground is worse than you're accounting for. I've watched Harlan lose posts in this valley for 20 years. Weston looked at the ground. He did this actually considered what she said, instead of simply maintaining his position, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him that she hadn't encountered often in men who held strong opinions. He considered it, and then he said, "Show me where you'd put the line instead." She walked him 30 feet south, to a place where the ground changed from rocky chalk to firmer clay. "Here, you lose some of the north acreage, but you keep the posts." He stood there and looked at it for a while. She watched him measuring it against whatever picture he had in his head of what he wanted the fence to accomplish. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her with a slight expression, not quite amusement, something adjacent. "You could say it less like you expected to be agreed with." "I did expect to be agreed with," she said. "The ground is obvious." "The ground," he said, "is obvious. You're less obvious." She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, not flattery. Weston didn't do flattery, but observation delivered straight. "Is that a complaint?" she said. "No," he said, "the opposite." They rode back in the early afternoon, and the day had the quality that some days have when they're carrying something important underneath the ordinary surface of them, the sense of something building. A pressure that wasn't unpleasant, but was present and needed to go somewhere eventually. It went somewhere that evening. Evelyn was in the kitchen with Rosa when Corinne came in from the back door, with an expression Evelyn had not seen on her face since the night in the barn, that particular look of doing something she wasn't sure about but had decided to do anyway. She's leaving, Corinne said. Mama, she told me this afternoon. She's going to her sister in Laramie. Rosa set down what she was holding and quietly left the kitchen. Evelyn looked at her stepsister. When? She said. End of the week. She said father can have the lawyers send papers. Corinne sat down heavily, like her legs had decided the conversation was better handled sitting. She also said, she stopped. She told me it was your fault. All of it. That you had always been determined to destroy what she built here. And what did you say? Evelyn said. Corinne looked at the table. I said I thought that wasn't true. A pause. She didn't speak to me for 2 hours after that. Evelyn sat across from her. That was hard to say. Yes. It mattered that you said it. Corinne looked up. It doesn't fix anything. No, Evelyn said. It doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. But it's the right direction. Saying the true thing when it costs you something. That's the right direction. Corinne was quiet for a while. Then she told me, when I was 15, that I needed to be careful about you. That you would try to take things that should have been mine. She looked at Evelyn carefully. I think I knew, even then, that it wasn't quite right. But I wanted it to be right because it made things simpler. If you were the problem, then I didn't have to look at her. Evelyn thought about that. The particular cost of the comfortable lie, it was almost never the person telling it who paid the most. You were 15, Evelyn said, and she's your mother. I'm not saying what you did was right. I'm saying I understand the mechanics of it. That's very measured of you, Corinne said, with something dry in it that caught Evelyn off guard, the first time she'd heard something that sounded like humor from Corinne in as long as she could remember. It took me about 20 years to get this measured, Evelyn said. Don't be too impressed. Corinne looked at her for a moment. Do you think we could, after all of this? Do you think we could be something other than what we've been? Evelyn considered that honestly. I think we could try, she said. I can't promise you what it would look like. We're not going to suddenly be close, and I'm not going to pretend the past few years didn't happen, because they did happen, and pretending otherwise isn't fair to either of us. That's honest, Corinne said. I find honest works better, Evelyn said. Even when it's uncomfortable. Corinne nodded. It wasn't a resolution. Both of them understood that it wasn't a resolution. But it was an honest beginning, which was considerably more valuable than a dishonest ending. Beatrice left on Friday. She came downstairs at 7 in the morning with 2 trunks and the particular composure of a woman who has decided that dignity is the only remaining currency available to her and intends to spend it carefully. She did not look at Evelyn. She said something brief and final to Harlan in the hallway, too quiet for Evelyn to hear from the kitchen, and then she went to the wagon that Harlan had arranged, and she got in and she drove out of the Marston ranch without looking back at it. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. She expected to feel something large relief or triumph or the particular release that comes when something long dreaded has finally finished. What she felt was quieter than that, more like the feeling of putting down a heavy thing you've been carrying for so long that you've forgotten what your own weight feels like without it. Not light, exactly. Just different. Corinne stood beside her at the window, both of them watching the wagon go down the drive. Well, Corinne said. Yes, Evelyn said. They stood there until the wagon was gone. The following days had the particular strangeness of a household recalibrating. The ranch kept going, it always kept going, which was one of the reliable things about ranch work, that the animals didn't pause for human drama, but the internal atmosphere of the house was like a room after a window has been opened. All the familiar smells changed slightly, the air moving differently through the spaces. Harlan was quieter than usual. He threw himself into the work of the ranch with the focused energy of a man who needed to be doing something concrete and measurable, and in the evenings he sat in his study, and Evelyn sometimes heard him moving papers around without clear purpose. The sound of a man who was sorting through something larger than documents. She went to him one evening, knocked on the study doorframe, and sat down across from him when he looked up. You should know, she said, that I'm not angry with you. Harlan looked at her. I have things I'm still working out, she said, about what you could have done differently and when. I'm not going to pretend that's finished, because it's not. But I want you to know I'm not sitting somewhere in this house carrying anger at you. I think it would be worse for both of us if I let you believe I was. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. He looked older than he'd looked a week ago, which she supposed was what it looked like when a man stopped looking away from something he'd been avoiding. Your mother would have managed it differently, he said. If she'd lived. She would have seen what was happening, and she would have dealt with it in the first year. Probably, Evelyn said. But she didn't live, and you did the best you knew how to do, and it wasn't enough. She held his gaze. That's the truth, and I think you need to hear it as plainly as I can say it. It wasn't enough. And I'm also still here, and I'm not destroyed, and we have more road in front of us than we have behind us. Harlan pressed his mouth together. He nodded, once, and it wasn't a man agreeing with a comfortable thing. It was a man accepting a true thing that wasn't comfortable, which was harder and worth more. Tell me what I can do, he said. She thought about it. Treat me the way you'd treat a son, she said, in the decisions about this ranch. The accounts, the breeding records, the sale decisions. I know this operation as well as anyone here. I want to be consulted like I do. You always should have been, Harlan said. Yes, she said. I should have. He picked up his pen, which was his version of a handshake. Monday, he said. Sit with me on Monday, and we'll go through the summer accounts together. Monday, she said, and went to bed for the first time in weeks, without the low-grade alertness of a person living in a house with something dangerous in it. She slept like she'd been building towards sleep for years. Weston came on Saturday. He came in the afternoon after the week's work was done, and he came without a specific horse problem or a ranch question, which Evelyn noticed and understood. He came to the front of the house, which he'd never done before. He always came around to the barn, or the paddock, the working side, and she answered the door herself, because Rosa was off on Saturday afternoons and Harlan was in the south pasture. He had his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with the directness that was simply how he was, and he said, without preamble, "She's gone?" "Since Friday morning," Evelyn said. He nodded. "How are you?" She thought about it. "Relieved," she said, "and a little unsettled." "Which I didn't expect." "The unsettled is because you've been braced against something for a long time, and it's gone," he said. "Your body hasn't caught up with the situation." She looked at him. "That's specific." "My father," he said briefly. "When he retired from the operation and I took it over, I spent 3 months expecting to be corrected every time I made a decision. He wasn't there to correct me, but I kept waiting." He paused. "It takes time," she stepped aside. "Come in." He came in, which he had never done before, never been inside the Marston house proper, only the barn and the paddocks, and the study on Thursday, and the kitchen on the morning he found her pounding on the summer kitchen door. He stood in the front room and looked around with the attention he gave everything, taking it in. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get coffee." She brought coffee and they sat across from each other in the front room of the Marston house, which felt slightly formal and slightly strange, and neither of them mentioned it. "I've been thinking about something," Weston said. "All right," she said. He held his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. "I want to ask your father for permission to court you properly." Evelyn stared at him. "I've been coming here for 6 weeks," he said. "Under conditions that were complicated, and not what either of us chose. And you've been dealing with things that nobody should have to deal with, while also trying to figure out what a small gesture between them is and isn't. I want to start over from a point where none of that noise is in the way." "Start over," she repeated. "Not everything," he said. "I don't want to forget any of it. The foal, Roman. The north fence line, which you were right about." A pause. "I want to court you the way I should have asked to from the beginning, without someone else's interference in the middle of it." Evelyn looked at him. "I'm 23 years old," she said. "I've been told most of my life that the formal version of things wasn't going to happen for me." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you that so you understand what you're asking me to adjust to," she said. "It's not resistance. I'm just being honest about where I'm starting from." "I understand where you're starting from," he said. "I'm asking you to let me be part of where you go from here." She looked at the coffee cup in her hands. Then she looked at him, at the straightforwardness of his face, the way he said hard things without ornament, the way he'd stood in her father's study and laid out what had been done to her with more clarity and fairness than she could have managed herself. "Talk to Harlan," she said. "He's in the south pasture." The corner of his mouth moved. "Now? While you're thinking about it," she said. "Before you talk yourself into making it more complicated than it is." "I wasn't going to do that." You were starting to, she said. You had the look. He stood up, set down the coffee cup, picked up his hat. I'll be back in an hour. I'll be here, she said. He was back in 40 minutes. Harlan came with him as far as the porch and then turned back toward the pasture with an expression on his face that Evelyn read from the window as something between relief and the complicated feeling of a man doing the right thing in an area where he'd been doing the wrong thing for a long time. Weston came back into the front room. He sat back down. He picked up the coffee cup and discovered it was empty and set it back down. He said yes, he said. I assumed, Evelyn said. He also said Weston paused. He said you were the best judge of horses and people in the territory, and if I was half as good a judge as you were, I'd know this was the right decision. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't unpleasant. He said that. Directly, she looked at the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing what it did this time of year going long in gold, making everything look slightly more significant than it was, or maybe just illuminating what was already there. He's been making up for lost time, she said, this week. In his way. People can do that, Weston said. Make up for lost time. It doesn't cancel what was lost, but it changes what comes after. She looked at him. You're going to keep saying things that are irritatingly accurate. Probably, he said. I'm going to disagree with you about fence lines and horse management for the foreseeable future. I'm counting on it, he said. The weeks that followed had a different quality than anything Evelyn had experienced in her adult life. Not easy nothing about rebuilding a household and a relationship with her father, and cautiously, incrementally, a tentative something with Corinne was easy but honest. Straightforward in the way that things become when the complicated layer of management and concealment is removed, and what's left is just the actual situation. Harlan sat with her on Monday over the accounts. He showed her everything: the breeding records, the sale contracts, the outstanding debts, the land assessments. He walked her through the decisions he'd made that summer and asked her opinion on 3 of them. And when she disagreed on one, he listened to her reasoning and then said he needed to think about it, which was not the same as agreeing, but was considerably better than dismissing it. Tuesday, she went over the breeding records and found 2 decisions that had been made on bad information a stallion acquired the previous year, who had a hereditary hock problem that hadn't been disclosed at sale, and a grazing contract that was costing them more than the land was worth in this drought cycle. She wrote both up in clear language with the numbers set out plainly and left the papers on Harlan's desk. He came to find her in the barn that afternoon. Where did you learn to read contracts? He said. I read yours, she said, starting about 8 years ago. They were in the study, and I had questions and I couldn't ask anyone, so I read. He looked at her for a long moment. 8 years, he said. You had a contract in 1881 that cost you $400. Because the water rights clause was written ambiguously, she said. I figured out why when I was 16. He was quiet. You never said anything. You weren't asking me anything, she said. Not bitterly, just factually. I'm asking now, he said. I know, she said. That's why I left the papers on your desk. He held out the 2 documents she'd written up. These are right, he said. Both of them. The stallion especially, I knew something was off about that animal, and I couldn't put my finger on it. You put your finger on it in 2 days. He looked at her over the papers. I'd like you to look at everything going forward, not consult. Look at everything from the beginning, with full access. Evelyn held his gaze. That's a significant change. I know what it is, he said. And I know it's later than it should have been. Yes, she said, it is. She took the documents back. I'll start on the fall contracts this week. The formal courtship, as Weston had called it, was not dramatically different from what had come before they rode together. They worked horses together. They argued about fence lines and breeding programs and the best approach to the water dispute 2 counties over that was slowly moving closer. But there was something different in the acknowledgement of it. The way Harlan nodded when Weston arrived and left them to it. The way the ranch hands had stopped looking slightly sideways when they saw Evelyn and Weston at the paddock together. The way the weight of having to be invisible had lifted from everything. Tom Eckhart came by one afternoon when Weston was there, and he stood at the paddock fence and watched Evelyn work Roman for 20 minutes before he turned to Weston and said, "How much would you take for that woman's opinion on my Western breeding stock?" Weston looked at Tom. She's not mine to sell. Tom looked at Evelyn. What would you take to spend a day looking at my horses next month? Evelyn thought about it. What kind of problems are you having? The kind that cost me money, Tom said. 2 horses that should be working and aren't, and my man can't figure out why. I'll come look, she said. Bring Weston and we'll call it a ranch visit. She paused. If what I find is fixable, I'll tell you how. If it's not, I'll tell you that too. Tom nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has just arranged a practical thing. Good. I'll send word on the date. After he rode off, Weston leaned on the fence beside her. He's going to tell everyone, he said. Good, Evelyn said. You're not worried about the attention? She thought about that the real answer, not the reflexive one. I've spent 20 years being worried about attention, she said. Worried someone would see me and form an opinion I couldn't control. I've been wrong about what to be worried about. She watched Roman in the paddock. The attention that comes from someone wanting your judgment on their horses is different from the attention that comes from someone deciding to look at you and see a problem. She paused. I think I'd like to find out what the first kind feels like for a while. Weston looked at her for a moment. You know what it sounds like when someone's worked something out, he said. What that, he said. Just now. That's what it sounds like. She didn't answer. She whistled Roman over from the far side of the paddock, and he came not perfectly, not in the straight line a fully trained horse would come, but he came, which 6 weeks ago he absolutely would not have done. He's going to be a good horse, Weston said. He already is a good horse, Evelyn said. He just needed someone to figure out what was actually wrong. The thing that Evelyn had not fully anticipated about the departure of Beatrice was what it did to the texture of small daily life. There were no longer comments at breakfast, no longer the particular quality of a room when someone is watching you from inside it, no longer the awareness of having to navigate every ordinary moment for the possible trap inside it. These were absences, not presences, and absences are strange to adjust till you keep bracing for the thing that isn't coming, the way you flinch at a sound that turns out to be nothing. She caught herself, twice in the first week, modifying what she was going to say at dinner. Old habit, the filter she'd developed for saying things in Beatrice's presence, the layer of management between what she thought and what she said. Both times she caught it and said the actual thing, and both times it was fine, which was itself a strange experience. Just fine. No consequence. No reading of the room required. Corinne stayed for another 3 weeks. She helped Harlan with correspondence and some of the lighter household management, and she and Evelyn ate meals together and occasionally talked about things that were not the immediate crisis Corinne's interests, which ran toward the social and organizational in ways that were different from Evelyn's, but were genuinely her own, and her plans, which were tentative but real. She wanted to go to Laramie eventually, she said. Not to be near her mother near enough to know she was all right, far enough to make her own way. You could stay here, Evelyn said, on one of the last evenings before Corinne was set to leave. Corinne looked at her. You mean that? I mean it's available, Evelyn said carefully. I'm not going to promise you it would be simple, but if you needed somewhere to be while you figured out what comes next, this is a place. Corinne was quiet for a moment. I think I need to go, she said. Not because of you. Because I've been in someone else's shape for too long, and I need to find out what my own shape is. She paused. Does that make sense? Yes, Evelyn said. It makes complete sense. But maybe I could come back, Corinne said. Not to stay, but to visit. If that would be yes, Evelyn said. If you want to. Yes. Corinne left on a Tuesday. She hugged Evelyn at the door, which was not something they had done before, and it was slightly awkward and slightly real, which was the appropriate ratio for where they were. Harlan watched the wagon go with his hands in his pockets. Do you think she'll be all right? He said. I think she'll figure it out, Evelyn said. She's more capable than her mother let her believe she was. Harlan looked at his daughter. Is that something you two have in common? Evelyn considered that. Maybe, she said, in different ways. October came in with the cold that Wyoming October always brought sudden and serious. Not a gradual cooling, but a shift, as if the territory had simply made a decision. The ranch work changed with it. The rhythms of feeding and watering and bringing horses in. And Evelyn moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had done it for years, and the particular pleasure of someone doing it now with actual authority over the decisions. She and Harlan had sat down twice more over the fall accounts. On the second session, he'd let her rewrite the terms of the hay supplier contract, and when she was done, he'd read it and signed it without changes, which was not something she'd expected, and which lodged somewhere warm and solid in her chest. Roman went back to the Blackwood ranch on a Thursday morning, and Weston came personally to collect him. Garrett was with him, the foreman who had looked at Evelyn with guarded suspicion on the day she'd told him about the brown gelding's vision problem, and who had, over the past weeks, sent 2 separate messages through Weston asking her to weigh in on specific horses. Garrett watched her load Roman for the trailer with the expression of a man who has revised an opinion and is not quite sure how he feels about having needed to. "He's going to be manageable," Garrett said. "He's going to be fine," Evelyn said. "Don't rush him past standing water. Give him the right angle of approach, and he'll do the work. He's not a difficult horse. You said that before," Garrett said. "Because it's still true," she said. Garrett looked at Roman, who stood with the calm attention of a horse who had learned that the things he was afraid of were not going to be forced on him. "I'll come back to you if there's trouble," he said. "Good," she said. "That's the right instinct." Garrett nodded and went to help with the loading, and Weston came to stand beside her. "He's been telling people," Weston said quietly. "About the horses?" "About you. That you're someone worth listening to." Evelyn looked at the paddock. "Is that good or bad for you?" "It's good," he said. "In the way that true things are usually good, even when they take a while to get there." She looked at him. The October morning was cold and clear, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and everything had the quality of a season finishing honestly, without pretending to be what it wasn't. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what comes next," she said. "Not about us, about the ranch. About what I want to do with what I know." She paused. "Tom Eckhart coming by, and Garrett sending messages there are people in this territory who have horse problems they can't solve, and they're paying for advice that doesn't work. I know things they need to know." "Yes," Weston said. "You do. I'm not going to hide in the barn about it," she said. "I spent enough time hiding in buildings." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know, that full direct attention that she'd had to learn to receive, because she hadn't been used to it. "What do you want?" he said. Simply, "Just asking." She looked at the cleared sky above the Marston ranch, the cottonwoods, the horses in the paddock, Roman being loaded calmly into the trailer while Garrett watched with new eyes. "I want to be seen doing what I'm actually good at," she said. "In the territory, by people who matter to this work." She paused. "I want what I know to count." "It already counts," he said. "I want it to count out loud," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then there's a stockman's meeting in November, in Casper. Horse breeders, cattle managers, the serious operations in the territory." He looked at her. "I'm planning to attend. I'd like you to come with me." She looked at him. "To Casper." "To Casper. As the person whose judgment I trust most on horses and cattle in this territory." He paused. "Also as the woman I'm courting, which these people are going to figure out about 4 minutes after we arrive." "That's going to be a conversation," she said. "Several conversations," he agreed. "Some of them uncomfortable. Are you bothered by that?" He considered it with the honesty he gave everything. "Some of it," he said. "Not the part about you." She looked at him. "Some of the territory is going to look at us and see exactly what my stepmother wanted them to see," she said. "A man like you making an unusual choice." "Yes," he said. "And some of them are going to look at us and see a man who knows good judgment when he's standing next to it." He held her gaze. "I'm more interested in the second group. And I think the second group gets larger the longer we're in the room." Evelyn thought about the stockman's meeting, the room full of serious ranchers. Walking in beside Weston Blackwood and having every person in that room form an opinion in the first minute, the way people did the quick reading, the categorization, the judgment she'd been subject to her whole life. She thought about what it would be like to stay in the room anyway. "November," she said. "First week," he said. "All right," she said. He looked slightly surprised. He'd been braced for more deliberation. "All right? I'm 23 years old," she said. "I've been preparing to walk into difficult rooms my whole life." The preparation was just pointed in the wrong direction. She looked at the trailer, where Roman was now loaded and calm. Casper is a room. I know how to manage difficult rooms. Weston looked at her for a long moment, with the expression that she'd stopped trying to deflect and had started trying to learn how to simply receive. Yes, he said. You do. The trailer rolled out of the yard, and the morning continued around them, ordinary and cool and full of things that needed doing and things that were being built. And Evelyn Marston stood in the yard of her father's ranch in the Wyoming October and felt, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, that the shape of the future was not something being managed for her by someone else. It was something she was making herself, one decided thing at a time. The stockman's meeting in Casper was held in the first week of November, in a long timber building that smelled like sawdust and tobacco, and the particular density of men who have been conducting serious business together for years and have developed their own rituals around it. Evelyn walked in beside Weston and felt every head in the room make the small adjustment that heads make when something unexpected enters a space. She felt it, and she kept walking, which was the only thing to do. Weston introduced her to 3 men in the first 10 minutes. He did it the same way each time: her name, the Marston Ranch, and then something specific she knew, the Roman-nosed stallion and the depth perception work, the brown gelding's approach problem, the breeding records she'd rewritten for her father's operation. He introduced her knowledge before he introduced her relationship to him, which she noticed and understood was deliberate. The third man, a rancher named Aldous Crane from a large operation near Cheyenne, listened to the introduction with the polite skepticism of a man who had been told surprising things before and had learned to reserve judgment. Then he said, "You diagnosed a vision problem in a horse by watching him refuse?" "I diagnosed it by watching the pattern of refusals," Evelyn said. "If a horse refuses randomly, it's temperament or training. If it refuses at specific angles in specific light, something else is happening." Crane looked at her for a long moment. "I've got a mare," he said. 3 years old. Everyone says she's difficult. I've had 2 men try to work her." "What does she do?" Evelyn said. He described it. She listened, asked 2 questions, and said, "Bring her to the paddock tomorrow morning before the session starts. I'll tell you in 20 minutes whether it's workable." Crane looked at Weston. Weston looked back at him with an expression that said this was exactly what he'd said would happen, and he'd been right. Crane looked back at Evelyn and said, 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she said. She worked Crane's mare for 35 minutes the following morning, while 6 men stood at the fence and watched. The mare had a pain response in her left hind quarter that had been misread as aggression, a simple muscular problem that had been left long enough to become a behavioral one. Evelyn found it by watching how the horse held her weight, not by anything fancy, just by looking at the animal with full attention and following what she saw. When she came back to the fence, Crane said, "What do I do?" She told him, specifically, practically, without softening it or making it more complicated than it was. He wrote it down, which was a thing she hadn't expected, but which made her feel something that took a moment to identify: the particular satisfaction of being taken seriously by someone who had no prior reason to take you seriously. By the end of the meeting's second day, 4 men had asked to speak with her. Not to Weston, not through Weston, to her directly. About horses, about breeding records, about a water rights contract one of them was trying to understand. On the ride back from Casper, in the cold November dark, Weston said, "2 of those men are going to write to you." "I know," she said. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about the honest answer. "Like I've been practicing for something my whole life, without knowing what I was practicing for," she said. "And now I know what it was." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The dark road unrolled ahead of them, and the Wyoming cold was serious and real, and Evelyn felt inside it something she'd been a long time arriving at: not happiness. Exactly. Which was too simple a word for something this complicated, but rightness. The particular feeling of being in the correct place, doing the correct thing, which is rarer than people admit and more valuable than almost anything else. The letters came in December. 2 from Casper, 1 from a rancher near Laramie she'd never met who'd heard about the meeting from Crane. All 3 asking for her assessment on specific horse problems. She wrote back to all 3, carefully and specifically. and charged a fair consultation fee that Weston had told her to charge, and that she'd been uncomfortable charging until she'd decided that discomfort was a holdover from being trained to believe her knowledge wasn't worth money. It was worth money. She knew it was worth money. She started charging it. Christmas came and went quietly. Harlan made an effort, a real one, imperfect and slightly awkward, the kind of effort that has value specifically because it costs something. He sat with Evelyn on Christmas evening and told her about her mother, things Evelyn hadn't heard before, specific memories, the sound of her laugh, the way she'd argued with the feed supplier every spring and always won. Evelyn listened and felt the specific grief of a person being given back something they'd lost before they were old enough to keep it. She didn't tell him it was fine. She just listened, and that was enough for both of them. Corinne sent a letter from Laramie in January. She'd found work helping to manage the accounts for a dry goods operation, which suited her in ways she hadn't expected. She said she was doing all right, which Evelyn read as true, and she said she thought about coming back in the spring to visit, which Evelyn read as something she was still deciding about, but meant. She wrote back the same week, which she wouldn't have done 6 months ago. February was when Weston took her to the creek. It was a Sunday afternoon, and not the kind of day that announces itself as significant, cold and flat, the creek running low under a skim of ice at the edges, the cottonwoods stripped down to their bones by the winter. They'd been riding, and had stopped here the way they sometimes stopped at the creek, because it was a place they'd talked and argued and worked things out over the past months, and it had accumulated the particular quality that places accumulate when important things happen in them. Weston got off his horse, and she got off hers, and they stood by the creek in the cold, and he reached into his jacket pocket and held out a ring. It was a simple ring, not elaborate. The kind of thing chosen by a man who understands that the statement he's making doesn't need to be made louder by the object. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know what comes with it, and I know what it costs, and I know we're going to argue about fence lines for the next 30 years. He looked at her. "I met you locked in a kitchen in a ruined apron, and you were the most capable person in that house, and the only one who didn't know the gathering was for you to walk into." He paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, not because you need me to, because I want to be in your life for the rest of it." Evelyn looked at the ring, then at him, then at the creek with its skim of ice. She thought about the brown work dress, the pies, the bar on the kitchen door. She thought about 17 years of being told a story about herself that wasn't true, and the particular damage that does not the dramatic visible kind, but the slow internal kind, the way water finds the crack and works on it season after season until the stone changes shape. She thought about what it had cost her to walk through the front door of her father's house that night beside a man she didn't know, in a stained apron, with flour on her arms, knowing every eye in the room was forming an opinion. She thought about what it had felt like to stop caring about that opinion and start caring about her own. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed it would need adjusting, had been prepared for that small awkwardness. "It fit. You measured," she said. "Rosa helped," he said. She looked up at him. "You went to Rosa?" 3 weeks ago," he said. She was very discreet about it. "She didn't say a word," Evelyn said. "She said one word," Weston said. "When I asked what you'd want." She said, "Plain." Said you had enough ornament in your life, from people dressing things up as something other than what they were. Evelyn felt something move in her throat that she didn't try to name. Rosa had been in that house for 11 years and had seen everything with the clear eyes of someone who had no stakes in pretending things were other than they were. "Plain, yes, that was right. Good," she said. Rosa was right. He looked at her with that expression, the full, direct one she'd learned to receive without deflecting, and she looked back at him, and the cold creek ran behind them, and the February sky was flat and serious above the cottonwoods, and nothing about it was particularly romantic in the way romance is performed in stories, and that made it exactly right. Real things were not performed. Real things just were. They were married in September, on the Marston Ranch, under the cottonwoods by the creek where he'd proposed. Evelyn wore a dress she'd had made specifically for herself, not fashionable in the way of the territory's social aspirations, not designed to minimize or reshape or apologize for the body inside it. Tailored for her full figure, in a cream wool that was practical for a Wyoming September and elegant in the way that things are elegant when they're honest about their purpose. She had not asked anyone's opinion on it. She'd told the seamstress what she wanted, and the seamstress, who was good at her work, had done it. When she looked in the glass the morning of the wedding, she looked like herself. That was the whole of what she'd wanted, and it was enough. Harlan walked beside her across the grass toward the creek. He was straight-backed and quiet, and when she glanced at him once, she saw on his face an expression that was grief and pride, in equal measure grief, for the years that had been what they'd been, and pride that was real and present and too late and still worth something. She didn't say anything to him about it. She just let him walk beside her, which was its own kind of answer to the question that had been between them. Corinne came from Laramie. She sat in the second row and watched with an expression Evelyn didn't try to read too carefully, and afterward she found Evelyn by the refreshment table and said, simply and sincerely, "You look exactly right." Evelyn looked at her stepsister and said, "Thank you for coming." Both of them understood that neither statement was as small as it sounded. The years that came after were not simple. Nothing real is simple for long. There were difficult seasons, a drought year, that hurt the Blackwood operation badly and required decisions that kept Weston up 3 nights running, and Evelyn beside him, working the numbers from every angle until they found the line between salvageable and not. There were 2 horses that defeated her problems she couldn't diagnose or correct, and she had to learn the specific discipline of knowing when to stop, which was harder than knowing how to continue. There were ranchers in the territory who never revised their opinion of her, who looked at Weston Blackwood's wife and saw the large woman from the Marston Ranch, and stopped their assessment there. And she could not fix their vision any more than she could fix a horse's depth perception by argument. But there were more who didn't. Tom Eckhart sent his foreman to her with 3 horses in the second year, and when those horses came back working correctly, he told everyone at the spring cattle meeting that Evelyn Blackwood had saved him 4 months of lost labor. Crane from Cheyenne wrote twice more and then referred 2 other operations to her, and those operations referred others. By the 3rd year, there were ranchers making the ride to the Blackwood spread specifically to have her look at horses they'd given up on, and she did not turn any of them away. And she was not wrong, often enough to undermine the reputation she was building, one solved problem at a time. Weston never described himself as the man who'd discovered her, or rescued her, or given her an opportunity. When people said things like that, and people did, because people need a story with a simple shape, he corrected them every time, without heat. She was already everything. "She is the night I met her," he said once, to Crane, who had said something well-intentioned and slightly wrong at a stockman's meeting. "The only thing I did was open a door, and she'd already been pounding on it." Evelyn, who had heard this from across the room, looked at her husband and felt the complicated warmth of being accurately described by someone who had been paying attention. The faded brown work dress, the one she'd been wearing the night of the gathering, the one that had never fit right, the one that was stained with cherry filling and flour and a long evening's labor, she kept it in the back of the cedar chest in the bedroom. Rosa had asked her once, early in the first year at the Blackwood Ranch, whether she wanted to get rid of it. "No," Evelyn said. "Why?" Rosa said with the directness she'd always had. Evelyn thought about it. "Because I need to remember what happened when I wore it," she said. "Not what happened before. What happened after? What happened after was the thing that mattered. What happened after was that she walked through a door she'd been told wasn't for her, and she stayed in the room she'd been told to stay out of, and she kept walking through doors after that, into her father's study, into the stockman's meeting, into the life she'd been building the skills for without knowing it her whole life. The woman Beatrice had dressed in rags and locked in a stone building so she wouldn't be seen became the woman the territory sought out when something was broken and nobody else could figure out why. She had not needed permission for any of it. She had needed to stop waiting for permission, which is a different thing and harder, and she had done it imperfectly, and not all at once, and with more doubt than the end of the story makes it look like. That was the part people didn't see, the doubt. The days she was still wrong about herself, still hearing Beatrice's voice in the back of her head, identifying the soft places. The work of talking herself past it, again and again, was not the kind of work that showed on a person's face or earned a reputation. But it was the most important work she did, Because what you believe about yourself determines what you're willing to walk toward. And what you're willing to walk toward determines everything. Evelyn Marston Blackwood knew, by the time she was 30, something she wished she'd known at 23, and hadn't, that no one could give you the permission to be what you already were. They could only confirm it after the fact. The confirmation felt good. She was not above enjoying it, but it was not the source. The source was the moment you decided, in the face of everything arranged to tell you otherwise, that you were worth the space you occupied. She had decided that moment in a kitchen, pounding on a door, in a dress that didn't fit, covered in flour, on the worst-dressed evening of her life, and everything else had followed from there.